All right, if you guys want to jump to Habakkuk, that is where we are. Habakkuk chapter 1 or Habakkuk,
Or Habs.
or there you go, Mr. H. Oh, wait, that's somebody else, right? Was it Mr. H in the what was that show? Happy Days?
Oh,
Maybe it was Mr. C.
Mr. C. Yeah,
Mr.
Mr. C.
C.
Yeah. Mr. H.
All right. So last week we started the book of Habakkuk. Thank you, Tim, for getting us through some of that we got through, how to properly pronounce his name. Wait, did we talk about that? I don't know that we did.
no.
So we don't know how to pronounce his name. And then we went through the first four verses, and I will admit, as we were going through, I was secretly going, don't get to verse 5. Don't get to verse 5. Because I want to do verse 5. And we didn't. We only got through the first 4, so we're going to do verse 5 this morning. But the first 4 verses, we see that Habakkuk is crying out to the Lord, and he is talking about how God's not hearing him, and he's seeing evil, and he's seeing violence, and he's seeing all these bad things going on, and he's praying, and God's not answering him. And so that's what he's saying. But then in verse 5, something incredible happens. And actually, it's so amazing, incredible, and yet the Bible doesn't say anything really about it. So we're going to start verse 5, but we'll read it, but then we're going to talk about the concept of what happens in verse 5 before we actually get to the verse. And good morning, Bill and Jody. It's good to see you guys.
Hi.
Morning. So let's start with verse 5, and I like hearing from the different versions Tim's got. So I'm going to ask Tim, can you read us verse 5?
Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. Would you like me to continue?
No, that's good.
Okay.
So what we have here is is Habakkuk crying out to God. Hey, good morning, March.
Good March.
We have
Morning,
Habakkuk. We're in Habakkuk chapter 1. We're just at verse 5. Yes. So what we have here is Habakkuk crying out to the Lord in verses 1 through 4. And then this amazing thing happens in verse 5. And we just read what God says, but we don't want to miss the fact that God actually responds back to Habakkuk, right? This is a pretty incredible thing. Habakkuk calls out to the Lord, and the Lord responds. And so we don't want to miss the fact at all. So we'll look at what he says in a bit, but first we don't want to miss the fact that God responds to him. And often people get this idea of God being, he's this big guy in the sky, really far away, far off. Maybe he can hear you, maybe he can't, type of thing. But what we see from Habakkuk is that's not the case at all. He cries out to the Lord, and the Lord responds. But what's really interesting is what he cries out to the Lord. So let's look at verse 2 real quick. He says, in verse 2, he says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save." So this is the charge that Habakkuk brings to the Lord. And I find this really interesting. His charge is, how long are you not going to hear me? And then what we see is God responds right away, or maybe not right away, but we see that he responds back to Habakkuk. And that's just really interesting to me, because it turns out that God was hearing Habakkuk. God did hear him. And so, you have to be a little bit careful, I guess, when you bring a charge against the Lord, and he brings it right back. It's like, nope, I heard you. I've been hearing you. And so I just think this is interesting. Why do you think in verse 2, he says, how long shall I cry and you not hear me? Why do you think Habakkuk thinks that God is not hearing him?
because he doesn't see any results.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar because he's been doing it for, well, praying to him or calling out to him for a long time and nothing has changed. Or things may have been getting worse.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so we have this interesting dialogue going on, right? Where Habakkuk is crying out to the Lord, and the Lord isn't responding in the way that he wants, and so he thinks that the Lord's not hearing him. And so this is this interesting thing that's going on. And I want to bring this up because I think this is something that a lot of people do struggle with. A lot of Christians from time to time do struggle with, is thinking that God doesn't hear them, or that maybe God hears them, but he doesn't respond. And what we see through the Bible is there's actually lots of instances where people talk to the Lord and he responds right back to them. And it's pretty incredible. And so it seems like it's more likely that it's possible that God speaks to us. And I wonder if there's a lot of times he speaks to us and we just don't hear him. We don't recognize or sense what's going on. And so we think he's not responding, even though he is. I don't know. What do you guys think? So, do you think there are some reasons that could come up so that we don't hear the Lord when he tells us something?
I think sometimes we don't like the answer he gives us, so
Right.
we don't want to hear it.
Right,
Yeah.
Okay.
exactly.
Well, as
Can you think of some
Looking
other
for
reasons?
the
Oh,
answer,
sorry.
just-
Or he answers us in ways that we don't understand. And then it's hindsight that we realize, oh, that's why, or you did hear me and you wanted what was for my best interest, and it was contrary to what I thought I wanted.
Okay.
And I'd
Tim, were
add,
you going to say something?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, go ahead. I'll wait. Whoever was.
I was just gonna pretty much what John just mentioned. You know, God has a worldview of things, and we're not seeing the big picture. His view of past, present, and future we can't see, and you know his delays are not always denials. It's just not in our time frame.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd add to that a dynamic of a dullness of hearing that can also occur if the message is the same. We don't like the message.
Yeah.
And you see that in the Bible where Jesus, or, you know, I mean, but you talk about Jesus and his death and he keeps telling them, I'm going to die. They don't like the message. They don't want to hear it. It's like, la, 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 you know?
Yeah.
So there's a dullness to it that can happen. And you can bring up Israel as well, because a lot of the warnings aren't new. These are written, they're scriptures as to what happens, but when they don't like the message, even the Lord speaks, they're accusing him that he doesn't speak.
Yeah.
And we can be the same way when we don't like the answer either, right? So
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think there's actually a lot of reasons why we might not hear the Lord. These are a few of them. I think sometimes also God will answer us before we ask him. And so he's already given us the answer, and then we go to ask him and we're like, why aren't you telling us? And he's like, yeah, I already told you. I already knew this was coming. You know, but there's other reasons too. I wrote down a list of things, but I was just, if you think about it, there's just a lot of interesting aspects of it. I think another big one is, you guys, you know what the phrase talking over someone is, or talking to someone? I think we can get in that mindset too, where we're talking to the Lord and we're saying something and he's responding and answering us, but we're not listening at all. We're just talking to him and saying, hey, you know, and we can get in that mindset as well. There's just a lot of interesting things. Another one is maybe you're just not used to hearing his voice, and so it's not easy to recognize. And that can happen as well. If you're not hearing his voice consistently, then it can be hard to recognize it. So there's a lot of interesting things. And I think all of this builds up into this place where people can get confused and think that God doesn't respond.
Well, John, I was going to add that, you know, the other one is it gets drowned out. You know,
Yeah.
we get so involved in everything going on in our day-to-day lives and all the noise around us and everything else, and we just don't even hear it, and because we got so much other stuff going on, you know. That's why
Yeah.
you have to take the time and stop and be quiet and you know, hear the gentle sound.
You observe children, and it's not hard to understand, right? I mean, when they're engaged in
Exactly.
something, you can
Yeah.
say whatever you want, and it's just like you're speaking, but no one's really listening.
Yep. And also,
that.
and children is a good example, right? Because we can see this on a day-to-day basis where there's different ways where communication just totally breaks down and they're not hearing. What were you going to say, Jake?
I was just gonna say, it's like having a relationship with God, right? For me, I look at my marriage, right? And when I first got married, I thought it was gonna be sweet, you know, and like everything was gonna be perfect in it, and it was gonna go smooth. And then problems occurred, and you know, we had to work through them, you know, and trust that our marriage was strong enough to get through these things. And when I had my kids, it was like, yeah, you know, excited about having the kids. And then, you know, as it went on, you know, more problems occurred, and, you know, raising children was difficult, you know, it's not for the weak, you know. And then I look at my faith in God, like trusting in the Lord, like when you see other people that don't trust the Lord or don't have a relationship with God, and they look like they're being blessed more maybe than you are, and you know, it's confusing, and it's hard thing to grasp or deal with, you know, knowing that, you know, your prayers aren't being answered, or things may be difficult for you, you know. But I think that's what God wants for us, you know, is that strong relationship, to have that strong faith, to be in our word, to be praying, to be fasting, to have discernment, you know, for us to gain that wisdom and all aspects of our life, you know. And I think marriage and raising kids is like, you know, it's an example of what that relationship with God it looks like, you know. And I mean, at least for me, that's the closest thing I could think of to having a relationship with God is like my marriage, you know. And through the hard times, through sickness and health, through the hard times, through the good times, you know. So
Yeah. That's good. And this is a good observation that we will bring up a little bit more once we get into verse 5. This is good. All right. There any other thoughts? I mean, I can think of another example, which is often we think that we're giving God a choice and say, hey, God, there's option 1 and there's option 2. Which one are we going to do? And he's like, no, you're in la la land. There's a whole nother plan for it. So there's lots of reasons, and this makes it interesting. It makes it so we got to work at it, right? We got to listen for him. And it's pretty amazing, though. But we don't want to forget that he actually does respond back to us. He does speak to us. And I'm convinced that not only does God want us to hear him, but he wants us to hear him and understand him. And he wants there to be clarity in that. And there's lots of examples in the Bible, but I like Gideon. And you guys might remember where he's told to go fight his enemies, and he's like, I'm not sure. And he says, okay, God, if you really want me to go, then I'm going to put the fleece out, and if it's dry and everything else is wet, then I know it's from you. And so he goes, and it's dry and everything's wet, and he's like, I'm still not sure, Lord. And I like this, right? He's like, I'm not, are you being clear? Let's flip it around. Let's make it wet and everything else dry. I really want to make sure it's from you. And God's like, yeah, okay, well, and he does that because he wants it to be clear for Gideon, right? He wants Gideon to understand, yes, this isn't just some freak accident. He is supposed to go up and attack his enemies. So it's I'm convinced that he wants us to hear from him.
And the cool thing about that too is the patient response from God. He could have been over it the second time, and be like, really, Gideon? And he could have made Gideon wet and then the ground around him dry too, just to mess with him. But he didn't do that.
That would have been awesome. That would have changed that whole story. I like it. But you're right, Elijah. He is very patient. And this is where the example of having children fall apart, because we aren't as patient with our children as he is with us, right? If our child asks us the same question over and over and over and over and over, we're going to finally be like, stop it.
Yeah. Mhm.
And
But
that
he's
would be
much
an
more
indication of immaturity as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we
That's
can
true.
be patient with that, but what it is at the end of the day, if you as a parent look at it, it's either, you know, obstinance and not really hearing you, or immaturity. And I think we, as believers, we sometimes don't want to put ourselves in that category.
Yeah.
As you know, we're grown, we've matured, we've experienced in life, or whatever it is, however old you are. But the uncomfortableness is the fact that from a spiritual perspective, there's still so much to learn. That, you know, you think like, I understood this, but not really. At least not in the fullness that you know God might want to work in it. And it's a tough pill to swallow for those that are proud about these things, or feel like they just get it, but they really don't yet. So
All right. Any last comments before we get into verse 5? Okay, so let's get into what God actually said. This is how he responds to I almost said Abraham, Habakkuk. And so he starts off and he says, look among the nations and watch, be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it were told to you. So this is kind of an introduction to what God's going to tell Habakkuk. But I really like, there's something interesting that happens here. And it's just really interesting, is that God does this thing where when he speaks to Habakkuk, he's emphasizing a whole bunch of things. And I say that because he says a lot of things twice. And there's a couple of places in here where he actually says the same word twice, which is really interesting. So let's, I want to look at that. And he starts off by saying, look among the nations and watch. So we can see here, he's telling Habakkuk to do two things. He wants him to look and watch. What do you think is the difference between looking and watching?
Paying attention.
The
Yeah.
amount of time you do it for.
Okay. I mean, this is for sure, again, this is God's emphasizing this, right? He's telling Habakkuk, don't just look, don't just watch, look and watch. And there's the pay attention aspect, there's the longevity aspect of it. There's a whole bunch of things that God is he's pointing out, hey, this is important. Don't miss this. I want you to look and I want you to watch. So I like this. And then the next line, this is cool. He says, be utterly astounded.
Mhm.
Does anybody's Bible say anything different than that? I'm just curious.
Amazed.
Mine says, yeah.
Mine says wonder marvelously.
Wonder marvelously. And Bill, yours says,
Amazed.
just be amazed.
Yeah. No, it
Oh,
says
man.
be utterly amazed.
Oh, okay. Be utterly amazed. Okay. I was like, oh man, that's such a letdown if it just says be amazed. And the thing that I want to point out here is where it says be utterly astounded, it's actually the same word twice. So he's saying be astounded, astounded, be astoundedly astounded, or amazingly amazed. He's really emphasizing that this is going to be something incredible. This is going to be something much bigger than what Habakkuk is recognizing, much bigger than what Habakkuk is going to understand. It's going to be big. It's so big that he uses the word twice. It's going to be amazingly amazing, or
Mine-
astoundingly astounding. Go ahead.
Mine says look and be amazed. And then down at the bottom, it says, Greek version says, look, you mockers, / look and be amazed and die.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty heavy.
Yes, it is.
Well,
But we can see, oh, go ahead.
no, I just said the word astounded. I mean, that to me, that's like stopped in your tracks.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, how many times in my life have I ever been astounded by something? You know,
That's a great point, right?
Yeah.
It's something big.
yeah. I mean, it's
And
probably
then,
something. Oh, good.
no, go ahead.
I was just saying, it's something that we all kind of are looking for. You know, that astounding moment. I think. You know,
Yeah.
when the Lord returns. You know, but back then they didn't know that that was the case. But yeah, I just think.
And he was asking God to change the people of Judah and his surroundings, but God's changing the whole world
Mhm.
Yeah.
because the Egyptians, the Assyrians, everyone's going to be affected by Babylonians conquering them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is likely that Habakkuk does not understand this concept at all, right? This is before any of that has happened. And so he's not catching this. He's, God's gonna try to point it out, but we'll get to something interesting when we get to the end of this verse. So let's work to the next phrase, and then we'll get to that interesting part on that fourth phrase. But the third phrase says, "For I will work a work in your days." And again, we have that word work, and it's the same word he's using twice. There's a different conjugation of it, but it's the same word. He's saying, I'm going to work a work in your days. He says that word work twice. Why do you think he says that? What do you think he's trying to point out here when he says, I'm going to work a work in your days?
Mm.
I'm looking verb now when I see it. So
Okay. You're saying but he could have just said, I'm going to do something in your days. I'm going to work in your days. He could have just said it once, but he says, I'm going to work a work in your days.
Well, obviously the word work means labor, right? So,
Okay.
so God's gonna, to me, gonna put a bunch of people to work,
I look at it like he's gonna do something that only he could do.
right?
Yeah.
That when you
Yeah.
look back, like, yeah, only God's hand could have done that.
Yeah. I think that's what he's emphasizing, right? That there's something big is going to happen, and he's making sure Habakkuk understands it's not out of his control. He's personally involved in what's going to happen. He's going to make that work. He's the one who's influencing it. He's the one who's providing the energy. He's the one who's establishing it and making sure it happens. He's the one who's doing it. So I think that's one of the things that he's pointing out here to Habakkuk is it's going to be astounding and amazing and incredible, something you don't expect. And then he's also saying, and I'm going to be the one who's making sure it happens. Even though it might look like somebody else is in control, he's telling Habakkuk, he's the one doing it. Good stuff. All right. And then he says this last phrase in verse 5, which I think is incredible. He says, which you would not believe though it were told you. And so here we have these three things as he's saying, look and watch. He's saying, be astoundedly astounded. And because I'm going to do a work, I'm going to do something, and I'm telling you what it is, and you're not going to believe me. So here's one of those things, right, where God can actually tell us things that we just don't understand and we don't believe because we're just like, I don't get, I don't get it.
Do you
So
think
here's
he's
one of,
pointing? Do you think he's pointing to Jesus?
no, because we will get to that in the next verse. But no,
Oh,
I
okay.
think he is telling them, he's telling them he's going to do something that they do not expect at all. And when we get to the next verse, I'll explain why I think that this is totally unexpected and a totally foreign concept. But in their mind, remember, in their mind, they are the chosen people of God. They
Right.
are the people who follow the true and living God. And what's going to happen as the Babylonians rise up and as they're preparing and they're conquering the world and making their way over to Israel, there's going to be a lot of false prophets who are going to say, no, they're not going to be successful in capturing Judah. because Judah is the faithful remnant. They're the faithful ones that follow God, and God's not going to allow it to happen. And so there's this whole concept that God would never allow this to happen because we're his people. And God is saying, I'm going to do something you are not going to expect. I'm going to do something crazy big, and I'm going to tell you what it is, and you're still not going to believe it. And I think this is what he's referring to. And we'll get into the more of that in verse 6.
But this is after the northern kingdom has already been taken over by the Assyrians.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those were God's people too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, I think, the assessment of people, I mean, despite of what Habakkuk believes, which is true that Israel and Judah belong to the Lord, but sometimes the assessment doesn't match the reality. And again, this really goes back to what God has already said, right? We have the entire New Testament, the Bible to kind of assess all of this to better understand things. But it would have been a tough pill to swallow. I mean, you could see a lot of parallels today, but I won't get into it, with this country and all kinds of things. I'm not equating this country as the people of God in any sense. I'm just saying there are a lot of people's, saying similar things, if you will, about that could never happen. Well, and always from this viewpoint of why, God, could you do this? Wouldn't it make it much worse? And that's probably what Habakkuk is thinking. I mean, there's no possible way he can dream up in his mind how any of this could be good or better or allow Babylon to take over. And but God is saying, even if I told you, you're not going to believe it. So it is just really interesting. That's all. But
And this brings up a good point, which is we can get in our mind that God can't do something, or he won't do something because it doesn't fit with who he is, but he's still able to do it. And sometimes we have this misunderstanding of who God is, and we need to recognize that we don't understand God. He is he is completely unique, and he's told us things about himself, and we can know that that is true. But there's a lot of aspects that we don't know about him because he hasn't revealed it to us. And so we can't get caught in this way of, oh, God wouldn't do that. And it always hits me when somebody says that about Jesus, when you'll see it on TV or talk to somebody and they'll say, Jesus wouldn't do that. And I'm like, I don't know. You have to think about it. I don't know if he would do that or not. And a lot of times I'm left going, I don't know. He's surprising, right? He does things in a way you don't expect. And that was one of the amazing things about Jesus while he was here on earth, as they were constantly trying to trap him and provide these, questions to him. And he always responded in a way that people didn't expect. He was very different. And so we don't want to.
Right?
Go ahead. What were you saying?
I was going to say, what's surprising to people sometimes is there's this whole thing of, okay, we need to be kind to our enemies and stuff like that, which is absolutely biblical. But then you get Jesus and you get John the Baptist, you brood of vipers, you whitewash. I mean, this sort of name calling that's fitting, but reveals the truth. And it doesn't violate, the nature of God, or it doesn't make him any less loving. And that's the contradiction sometimes in our heads that we can't fit together. But what's really interesting, John, is you brought up the fact that God chose to reveal himself to us, and that's what we have to go on. And we're going to get there, because it challenges that view, because we say, well, how can this fit with your action? But in reality, it does. It's just, we don't know the other side of what he's, how he's, it's an amazing thing, this little book. But anyhow, I'm excited to talk about it. Keep going.
No, and this is a great topic to understand for your lives. If God wants to astound you, let him astound you, right? Don't be stuck in this place of, I'm not going to believe you because I don't understand you. You let it happen. He's bigger than that. It's pretty cool. All right, let's hit verse 6. Wow, I'm moving at a slow pace. So
Are you doing it in honor of March because he's here? Is that, I just want to ask.
That's right. That's right. All right, verse 6. Let's see, who wants to read verse 6? Oh, wow. You guys all at the same time.
Oh,
All right.
man.
Let's see. Elijah prayed. So let's go with Mr. Edwards. John, can you read verse 6?
Absolutely. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. Got the washer draining right now. I'm sorry about that, guys.
Well,
We can hear it. All right. So he starts off with, for indeed, I am raising up the Chaldeans. And just so we're all on the same page, that is the Babylonians. That's what they were called. And that's that people that live in that area. And that's going to be the Babylonian Empire. And so he says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. And this is really interesting what he says about them, a bitter and hasty nation. And that word hasty, it means liquid. They're like fluid. They're kind of this fluidy, liquidy nation, which in my mind, when I'm picturing them as a fluid, I'm picturing them as, as like a river or like a stream, right? It's this thing that's fluid and it's moving all over. It all kind of moves downhill, and really there's a lot more power behind it than you realize. It's like if you tried to dam up a stream or a river, the water dams up and then it goes around, right? It goes over. You can't stop it. And so that's the idea that I get when he says that hasty, that's this powerful nation that you aren't going to be able to stop, and they're going to freely move throughout the world. But he also calls them bitter, and that word bitter literally means bitter. It actually says, when you look up the definition, it says figuratively or literally bitter.
yeah.
So my question to you is, what do you think it means that they are a bitter nation, a bitter and hasty nation?
There's rage in there. The next following verses, 6 included, this is a military strategy. You can look upon it as that. And this is really shows the strategic important aspect of the Babylonian army, and that the bitter is their, to me, it's their fury and how they fight. And I see that as a fierceness of their warriors. Because if you go back to their culture, you wouldn't consider them bitter for the cultural aspects that they accomplished.
Okay. Any other thoughts? This is interesting. I like it when God uses these types of adjectives to describe things, and it makes you think about, because he's got a different perspective of things than we necessarily do. All right. And so he says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. They're a bitter and hasty nation. And then he says, which marches through the breadth of the earth. And now check out this last phrase here, to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. And I think this right here is the hiccup. It is the stumbling block for Habakkuk and the Jews, where he says they're going to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. And to just explain it a little bit better, let's jump back to Joshua chapter 24. So this is when the Israelites have come into this land of Canaan. There's something that he says there to Joshua. And so, Charlie, are you up for reading verse 13?
Sure.
24:13?
Just verse 13.
Yeah.
Okay. I have given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build, and you dwell in them. You eat out of the vineyards and olive groves, which you did not plant.
So if we read this chapter, also several times God tells the Israelites that he's giving them this land to possess. And so here's this promise that God made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that they were going to get this land. They were going to possess this land. And when Joshua moves in, they get to possess land. They get to possess cities that they didn't build. They get to have these vineyards and these farmlands that they didn't, raise up. They get to come in and they get to own it and they get to possess it. And it's a promise to them. And it's a promise to them because of the faith and obedience of Abraham. So here we have this picture of Israel where they're like, we're the chosen people of God. God loves us so much that he's giving us this land and giving it to us to possess because we serve him. And then what we see him telling Habakkuk is, yes, you got all of that, but I'm going to give it to the Chaldeans now. I'm going to give the Chaldeans this same type of blessing. And so for a lot of Israelites, a lot of Jews, those in Judah, this is going to be confusing. They're not going to get that, right? They're going to say, wait a second, those Chaldeans, they follow other gods. They don't follow Yahweh. They don't have that same promise. They weren't faithful. There was no one who had a lot of faith in Yahweh, and yet he's giving them this same promise. And he doesn't actually give them that promise. He gives this promise to Habakkuk, but still it's the same type of thing. And so I think we were talking about it earlier, Jake, this is this stumbling block for them. This is this thing that they're not understanding, which is God gave it to them because of their faithfulness, but he can give it to somebody else and it doesn't have to be because they're faithful.
Mm.
I don't know. What do you guys think? What's that?
Well, it's interesting, John, that Habakkuk's main complaint to God is violence and injustice.
Yeah.
And God's saying, yeah, I'm going to give you more violence and more injustice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
And that's, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead, John. Finish your thought.
I was just going to say, and that's not what you would expect, right? That's not the answer you would ever expect from God. You wouldn't say, hey, God, why is all this injustice abounding? And him saying, I'm going to make it abound even more. That's not ever a response you're going to expect from him. Go ahead, Elijah.
I was just thinking of like from a dad builds up a business, he passes it down to his son squanders that blessing, that opportunity, and he hands it off to someone who is not in the family. I just was reminded of that picture. It's like, I'll give you a trial period to see what you do with it. And God's trial period, because his concept of time is so outside of us, is a lot longer than ours. But anyways.
But when you talk about that's not something you would expect, John, what comes into my mind again is what was already previously said.
Yeah.
From prophets all the way back to Moses. Even before he died, he said, I know you're going to be an obstinate people, and when you do this is what's going to happen. I mean, the curse of Mount, was it Gerizim versus Mount, I don't remember what the other mountain was in Deuteronomy. And that's the thing. Sometimes we forget what God has said and that he means what he said. Now, a lot of time has gone by through a lot of idolatry, through a lot of rebellion, starting with the book of Judges, right? And all the way through. And Habakkuk's view, I think, is a little bit narrow because, obviously we're invested in this narrow view because we don't want it to come. But at the same time, you really sit back from a third party perspective, in which we can do right now, right? And looking into this is that God's warned prophet after prophet after prophet, of these things that are to come. So in that sense, I guess I wouldn't say, if I were an observant third party that was neutral in all this, I would just say God is faithful to his word, and he had a lot of mercy along the way. But this is a people that not only ignored, but even up to this point, somewhat has chosen or accused God of saying, well, why are you doing this when he's already said this is what he would do if you have. So it's a really difficult sort of tension, right? Because we don't want it to happen, but realistically, this is sort of what God has already said, and we just don't like to, again, go back to, we don't like these parts of the Bible because it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
When the judgment of God comes at his sovereign will, right?
And I think this goes back to what he says in verse 5 is, I'm going to tell you something which you won't believe, though it were told to you. And I think this goes back to what you were saying, exactly all the way back to Moses, where they have the two mountains, talking about what God's going to do. And Moses is telling them, hey, you're going to stumble away from God, and he's going to take these blessings from you. God told them this was going to happen, and they didn't believe it. and we're at this point too. And now it's much closer. And what's going to happen is the degree to how it's going to happen is extreme. And so he's telling Habakkuk and he's telling you, I'm going to tell you, I'm still telling you this, and you're still not going to believe it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is still a demonstration of grace, though, right? Because this is a warning. So it's amazing that, it's probably over 800 years since the possession of the land. And so, and prophet after prophet, like what Rich says, God's saying, turn and change and turn and change and follow me. And then now he gives a warning of the future, which is still gracious, because he could have just said, we're done, right? We're pulling the plug. I'm sending these guys without any warning, and he doesn't owe them an explanation. But to explain it away early on gives you time to change and repent still, but they don't take that opportunity. But what catches me here is, even as God is talking through like some scary stuff in the future, it's actually a demonstration of grace, because it's a warning and gives them time to change. But ultimately they don't. But just holding back his fury this entire time is so gracious. So it's just grace upon grace upon grace upon grace.
I mean, and he doesn't even have to speak to Habakkuk, right? He could just, it's a good thing I'm not God, right? Because if I was, then I would have been like, I've had enough with you. I'm not going to answer your question. But God does. He does go back and he speaks to Habakkuk and he tells them. And I think there's a big part of grace in this where he says, for I will work a work in your days. So that when it starts to happen and they're like, my whole world is falling apart, they can look back here and recognize and see that God is still saying, no, he's the one who's in control. Your world's not falling apart because it's just randomly falling apart and he's not in control. It's falling apart because he planned it and he warned you. And there's still that idea in your head where you can be like, oh, I see God's doing this and I can repent and turn to him. It's great.
And you see this play out in the book of Daniel, right? Because nobody could think you could go to Babylon and succeed, because we'd be all dead. But the opposite was going to be true. So it's just really, I mean, again, we have the benefit of seeing this on the other side, but it's amazing how everything kind of ties together. So, but I won't take us down that road, because Daniel's the continuation of this, right? So
I noticed something right at the beginning of verse 6 is this, I am.
Yeah.
He is saying, I am raising, it's his authority. He's doing this.
Yeah.
And he's going to raise up the Babylonians. And he described how nasty they are. And though they're going to take your homes, you guys are going to lose everything. This is by my authority.
Yeah. And this is a great thing for us to recognize, for us to understand, and also recognize that this is not just for Habakkuk and the Jews. This is for us as well. We can read the very similar type of thing in the book of Revelation when God says he's going to do these things, and you read it and it's like, I don't understand. It's so amazing. What does it mean when he says he's going to roll up the heavens like a scroll, right? What do all of these things mean? Because what it's going to be is so incredible and so amazing. And at the same time, he's telling us so that we know when all of this happens, he's the one who's doing it. It was all planned. It was all what he's doing. He's the one who's in control. It's not because the world is falling apart. It's because God is in control. Yeah, it's a good point, Jody. I like it. All right, I'm looking at the time. I'm trying to decide what we should do. We got 10 minutes, and if I move to the next verse, we're not going to make it in 10 minutes. So let's do something a little different. Instead of going to verse 7, we'll save verse 7 for next week. But before we do that, let's look at a little bit of context for what's going to happen. And let's look at something David says. So if you guys don't mind, we're going to move to my favorite Psalm. It's Psalm 52. And so, like I said, this is my favorite Psalm. There's a lot of context with Psalm 52. If you read right before the verse 1, it says, to the chief musician, a contemplation of David, when Doeg the Edomite went and told Saul and said to him, David is gone to the house of Ahimelech. There's a lot that goes on with this, and I would love to discuss that, but we don't have the time, and it's not super relevant to what we're going to do in Habakkuk. So let's just read through Psalm 52, because I want us to get to a point here which will be a prequel to the to Habakkuk next week. So let's see. Dad, would you mind reading? How many verses are there? 12, 13, 10, 9. Can you read the first 4 verses, Dad?
Sure. Why do you boast of evil, you mighty men? Why do you boast all day long? You who are a disgrace in the eyes of God, your tongue plots destruction. It's like a sharpened razor, and you practice deceit. You love evil rather than good, falsehood rather than speaking the truth. You love every hurtful word. Oh, you deceitful tongue.
All right, I'm going to read the rest. It says, God shall likewise destroy you forever. He shall take you away and pluck you out of your dwelling place and uproot you from the land of the living. Selah. The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, saying, here is the man who did not make God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise you forever because you have done it. And in the presence of your saints, I will wait on your name, for it is good. So here we have this psalm that David brings up, and he's contrasting 2 types of people. There are the mighty man, and then there are those who put their trust in the Lord. And it's interesting because you would think, you know, I want to be the mighty man. I want to be mighty. And what David is saying here is the mighty man is not someone who is mighty. It is someone who trusts in their might. And so what we're going to see when we get to Habakkuk is this is a pretty good description of the Chaldeans, of the Babylonians. They get in this place where they think they are mighty and they are strong because of the power that they have. And what we see David saying is in verse, verse 6, he says, the righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, saying, here is the man who did not make God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches. And so what David is saying here is, you know, these guys are mighty, but you can laugh at that because no one is strong enough to conquer death. No one is strong enough to do a whole bunch of these things. No one is strong enough to resist God, but God is strong enough. And I love this, especially if we look at this conquering death picture, right? We can't conquer death, but Jesus did, and he can. Or he rephrase that. He can, and he did. He conquered death, and then he promised to us that that conquering of death was proof that we don't have to be afraid of death anymore. I like it when you read in Matthew, when you read about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, because in there's this verse that just is like, what in the world? And it talks about how there's this earthquake and a whole bunch of people come back to life in the graves. The graves open up and people come out and come back to life. And we often kind of skip over it. But I think the point of that is to remind us that if he can conquer death for himself, he also plans on doing it for us, because that's a promise. And these people come back to life because he's saying, hey, death has no power anymore. God's the one who's in control. And so this is this picture that we're going to see in Habakkuk. There's these group of people. There are going to be those who put their trust in their own strength, and yet they're still going to die. And then there are those who put their trust in the mercy of God, because he has power over all of that. So I think that's where we're going to end it for today. Anybody have any comments before we close it out? We have some time.
I think that human nature, eventually every society rises up to power or is doing well, becomes Babylon, you know. And I just think about what's going on with our country and how people are going further and further away from God. And I'm just wondering what the wake up call is going to be. But at the same time, it's all in God's plan. And I'm looking at what God's telling to Habakkuk and how he's going to do it and what's going to happen. And so just stay in the word, because all the clues and everything that's going to happen is in there, right? So
you bring up an interesting point, and we internalize it and personalize it and think of our country, but also I'd point out Israel. Even today, Israel feels like they have strength, right? They have nuclear, at least a nuclear weapon, and they have all of these countries that would love to see the destruction of Israel, and they are feeling like, hey, they've been able to hold them off, right? They can do these special operations in Iran and prevent them from having enough to destroy them. But what we actually see in the Bible is God has a prophecy where they are going to get invaded by all these countries. If you want to read in Ezekiel, there's this interesting prophecy where God is they're going to be invaded. They're going to lose. It's going to be, these countries are going to come in, and then God's going to take care of it. His promise is that he's going to work it out so that everybody recognizes he's the one in charge, none of these countries, including Israel. So I think it's interesting. All right. Well, I guess we will end it there. Next week, we will look at what God says about the Chaldeans and how this is completely non-intuitive for the Israelites or for the Jews, because they do not follow the Lord. They do not follow his ways. They're very different.